I'm the founder of HOC. Been in this customer experience space for a while. We've been around for 10 years as a company, and this has really become my favorite topic. Since I went out and interviewed over 200 of you CX leaders and understood what was really top of mind. And this was a topic that kept coming back about, I know that customer experience is driving business value, but how can I connect the dots so that maybe more skeptical members of my organization will buy into it? And so I've talked about this, a lot of it in the book, Do B2B Better. We have some white papers on it. But then a couple of months ago, I was introduced to a rock star, which is Topher. And Topher, I'll let him introduce himself, but his full-time job is doing that, is helping show ways that customer experience is connecting to value at individual companies. And so when I met him, we had a great conversation. I said, we've got to do things together. So we've written a blog post. We'll share that link at the end today. We did an in-person event here in Minneapolis last week. Yes, in-person event in December, but actually we were okay with the weather. And so I asked him as well to do this event today. And so go ahead, Topher, introduce yourself.
All right. Thank you, Jim. I'm honored. Really generous intro, and especially grateful because Jim's been so tuned into this topic for so long. So I feel like kindred spirits finding each other. Jim did a good intro. I've been with Qualtrics for about 9 years, and my teams and I have been focused on helping CX professionals get budget for investments, to track the value of their programs, and to quantify the impact of the actions they've been driving. And we've been involved with over 1,000 of those engagements. So we've seen a lot of things, but also we keep seeing new things. So looking forward to seeing the comments and questions come through in the chat. So anyway, glad to be here. Back to you, Jim.
All right. And so today's going to be a little bit different. Yes, of course, we have slides. The Department of Webinars requires us to have slides. We have slides here. We had to negotiate over Google Slides or PowerPoint, but it's going to be mostly a conversation. And as I mentioned last week when we did this in person, we were really just kind of freewheeling, talking about things, having a fun conversation. So feel free to hop in with questions. Now, again, we are looking at the Q&A, not the chat. So if you chat, I probably won't see it, but put your questions to Q&A. And we're going to go into and start talking about how you can show value. Now, before we lose people say, well, I'm not on Qualtrics. Today, we're not going to be talking about how to use Qualtrics as such. Although I will share in our research, many of the most effective programs were on Qualtrics, although so are some of the less effective. It is more how they used it. And that's what we talk about today. And what we're talking about today can apply to any platform you work with. We happen to be fans of Qualtrics, so we have Topher on today. But let's go ahead and hop into it. I want to share an email I got a couple of months ago. And it was almost the right question. And representative from a very large organization said, we're building a financial model for customer experience. So, all right, well, that's fantastic. That's exactly what we should be doing. Then she continued on, can you tell me any research that shows that at 1 point of increase in satisfaction means this revenue increase? And that's when my heart sunk. Because that's going about it wrong. It's not what's happening through secondary data. And really what I thought who articulated this quite well is in my book, Olga Budieri, who at that time was the head of customer experience for Aramex. She since moved on to another role here. But this is what she said to me, and it really resonated. And she said that we've all seen those studies where a 1 point increase in CSAT, customer satisfaction, equals this revenue. But to a commercial officer, a CEO, or a CFO, this doesn't sound real. So it doesn't put customer experience in a credible position. Now, I'll pause for a minute. Last month, I shared that the two executives your CEO listens to the most are CFO and COO from IBM data. And so she's saying, if you bring that secondary data, it doesn't put you in a credible position. Now, many of you may be familiar with, for example, the watermark study, which shows how leaders had greater stock increase than laggards did in CX. But there's another example. And let's go on to hear more what she had to say. We need to prove this based on our own data. These are the scores for the past year. And this is the revenue or the growth in revenue and the growth in shipments for these exact companies. And this is what it looks like. This is a correlation between the revenue and customer satisfaction and NPS, again, with our data. And so it's a call to action from Olga that you can't come into your executives with secondary data. You have to show it with your own data. And today we'll be giving you ideas on how you can do that. I'm going to stop my share here because Topher, I'd like to see what the participants had to say about the benchmarking questions we asked them.
All right. And I want to chime in on that that comment too, because I also get the same question. I've gotten it at least 100 times of what's the dollar value of a 1-point improvement in NPS or satisfaction, or fill in the blank with your metric of choice. And it raises a really important point that, value to customers and value to the business are related, but they're not the same thing. You can't use A as a proxy for B. And I would even go half a step further to say that while correlation is really good for prediction, so when I see a dissatisfied customer, how likely am I to see them churn? In generating insights, where should we invest? What parts of the experience do we think let's build a hypothesis. Where's the investment going to have the best payoff? In order to make claims that you caused or created some value, you have to establish a cause. And that's where actions come in. What are the actions that you're driving in the organization? And that's what the value can be attributed to. So anyway, I just love that comment. So thanks for bringing that quote up, Jim. Let's look at the results. I think that we're still getting some come through, but let's see where we are today for this group. How well has your organization connected experiences to financial outcomes? Most of those today stuck in 1 and 2, a few in 3, or about a third in 3. Anybody surprised by this? Any reactions to this? Jim, what do you think?
This is pretty well what we've seen. Across different data sources, we typically see that only 1 out of 4 programs, or actually 3 out of 4 programs, are typically at the lower bucket. Here we're at 66, so a little bit lower, but a smaller sample size. But research in my book, research from the XM Institute, we'll see in a minute your research from Customer Think, all pretty much show that 3 out of 4 programs are not doing well at all, or only doing slightly well at connecting to financial outcomes.
Let's see what people are saying when it comes to why. Top one, there's so much going on. We often have smaller teams than we'd like to have. We just don't have time, and we haven't prioritized it. The second, which is totally real and reasonable. Also, we just need a playbook. We need somebody to teach us how to do it effectively. Organizational support. So sometimes you need to go and get access to resources like data analysis resources or data or other things, and that can be hard. Necessary data not available. So, we want to connect the actions or experiences we're delivering to, let's say, customer churn, but organization doesn't measure customer churn, they just don't exist. Or, we looked at the data, so we found the data that we thought we needed, and we were hoping that we would find the relationship, but we didn't. And so that's very real too. I want to give it back to Jim to share your screen. We've been running this benchmarking study for about 1.5 years, and I want to show you all how it compares.
All right, so let me go find my share button here. There we go.
And you'll all see that it's pretty consistent. So we find that usually it's somewhere around like 75% of CX professionals or programs are kind of stuck in the red, or they're stuck in level 1 and level 2. And Jim mentioned earlier, there's a lot of research that also supports this, conducted by other companies or other research groups. And then if you want to click forward one more, Jim, the reasons for this being a challenge, we often break into three. One is just, we need the playbook. We need to know how to do it. Number two is, we looked at the data, or we just data problems. And then number three is, not a priority, or we need support from the organization. The screen kind of went gray, Jim. I don't know if it's being slow or something.
Is that better? Can you see it now?
Might be just me. All the pages have kind of a gray filter on them.
Okay, let me stop sharing and reshare then.
So anyway, thoughts in the chat. Like, why do you think that is? Why is that such a challenge for CX professionals? Why might that be?
Well, while you're chatting, I'd say, okay, good. Thanks, Thomas. Some of you know, or many of you know, Ben London in our team, and he started the customer experience program at a large global organization. And his boss said, hey, don't worry about showing ROI. I know it's the right thing to do. Just start driving change. So Ben took that direction, and he went out and focused on driving change. Well, his organization would not be the first one with a reorg. And his leader left. New leader came in. Anybody guess what that new leader's first question was? Yeah. What are you doing? How do we know anything you're doing matters? He was looking for the ROI that Ben had been told don't create. And so Ben was put in a bad position. So even if your CEO, your CFO, or your boss is not asking for this connection today, don't think you don't have to. Because first of all, the rest of your organization is looking for that. And second of all, that may change. And Roger, yes, definitely. It's the C-suite love language is data. And that's what we're talking about here today. So it is really important to do that. You may not have the skill set. And Julie says it can be hard to correlate impact and customer experience efforts. We're going to walk through some examples, how others have done this to maybe give you some ideas. We'll also at the end have a QR code if you want to set up time with me to talk more about what we've seen. I'll be happy to do that. So still getting dark slides, huh? Okay, let me try sharing the whole screen. Maybe that will change things.
Yeah, and while you're doing that, one other comment too, like CX is a relatively new category. So when you think about procurement, that's been around for hundreds of years, like the playbook has been written and refined and really well disseminated. And so CX is far more on the cutting edge. And so the playbooks that are useful for doing that may not have been fully written or fully disseminated, so that you don't come into a new role and know exactly the playbook for how do we connect this program to value. And so I think of this group as somewhat of disruptors or innovators. You're out figuring it out, but also me and Jim's job, we want to make it really easy and hand you the playbook. So anyway.
Definitely. Well, so in my book, Do B2B Better, I introduced the customer experience loyalty flywheel. Now, this didn't come from me. This came from interviews over 200 of you here. We found that, first of all, that when an organization invests in customer experience, well, that experience gets better. Okay. Pretty straightforward logic at this point. As a result, then, our customers become more emotionally engaged with us so that they buy more, stay longer, interact in ways less expensive to serve, and the business gets better. Okay. At this point, you're probably saying, well, duh. I mean, this is customer experience right here. This is what the whole point. So why do we need a model for something so simplistic? Because, if we didn't believe on this, we wouldn't be at your webinar, Jim. True, but that's not the magic. The magic is what the change makers did. And what the change makers was, those were those 25% who could show impact. And they involved the customer ecosystem data. And so let's say, for example, you're improving self-service. As an example, it could be adding new capabilities, whatever it is. But let's use that as an example. So you make the improvement, then when customer experience improves, well, of course, we add a survey, or we use a survey on that new process. But the change makers also bring in the operational and behavioral data. So, for example, Gloria Gupta at the American Medical Association, she spends a lot of time looking at the data to look for channel switching. Those who start out in digital and then flip to analog. Because that's a lose-lose. Your clients didn't want to do digital analog, they went to digital, and you have to spend the money of working through the analog. And so she brings in that behavioral data. Behavioral is what customers do. I see it as another form of voice of the customer. Also, operational data. So, for example, when you improve self-service, does your response time get better because you're receiving fewer calls? And so incorporating that behavioral and operational data into your analysis is one of the things that change makers do. Now, we're not here to talk about the emotions part. I could talk about that all day long, but they measure an emotional North Star, such as trust or confidence. And then they look at the behavioral and financial data. So, for example, when you changed your self-service, did you find that the customers who use the new self-service are actually reducing calls, behavioral data, and ordering more from us in the future, financial data? Or can you show that we reduce calls by 20%, operational data? And then, do you know the cost per call? Let's say it's $25. Well, you take the number of calls times 20%, the reduction, times $25, and you can start showing the impact of the work you do. And then bringing in customer lifetime value, net revenue retention. I'm a big fan of that. Annual recurring revenue, which is more of a SaaS measurement, but tying this all into what the business cares about. If I were to ever take another CX practitioner job, nobody would hire me, but if they did, first thing I would do for most organizations is I would become the captain of net revenue retention, which is a combination of retention versus churn and how much your clients are ordering from you. And then they surround all this with change management. And this is what I found by talking to the great change makers out there in the organization. Now, in the book, we talk about hopefuls versus change makers. A change maker is somebody who can prove their work is creating the outcome where customers want to buy more with you, stay longer, and interact in ways less expensive to serve. Most are hopefuls, what are doing good work, and they hope it has an impact on the company. So to get you started with thinking about this, we've identified 4 common KPIs that are linked to CX.
Can I chime in on that
Yeah,
last
go
one,
please.
Jim?
Yeah.
So first of all, I just love the framing of change makers versus hopefuls. Change makers implies action, like we're driving action, like we aren't just like sending insights over the fence to other teams and hoping they take action. Like we're taking accountability to driving action in the business, and that's really what creates the value. And so I love that. You talked earlier about the importance of first-party data, and I think this flywheel brings it to life. Like we can't go through this flywheel without data from our own customers in our own business. And then the third thing that I really like is how you go to behavioral data. So individual customer behavior, that's what you want to connect to. Hey, we provided a new experience to a group of customers or a cohort of customers. How did their behavior change as a result of that new experience that we provided to them? And then it ladders up to those bigger metrics like CLV, NRR, those other factors. So anyway, I love this flywheel, Jim. Thanks for sharing.
You bet. And I want to actually take this moment. I know we've got a Q&A section later on, but to answer Sarah's question she asked here. Thanks, Hamdi, which is how do you show it with your own data when the life cycle of your product is several years? Now, as many of you know, I'm a big fan of B2B. And like Sarah calls out, that's a real issue. One of our clients, Link Logistics, they're the second largest owner of industrial property in the US. Most of their leases are 5 years old. I have 5-year lengths of life cycles. So like Sarah's problem, it's really hard to link to churn because if we make a change today, we have to wait an average of probably 2.5 to 3 years before we really see that impact. It matters. And we talked about last month that growth is what the CEOs care the most. But you can't really tell your executives, hey, trust me, in 2.5 years, I'm going to come back with some awesome data showing how much change we created. Yeah, I think Sarah's going to say that that's not going to work for her. It won't work for most of us. Well, then in that case, it's coming back to what other areas can we show short-term impact? And in fact, at our Do B2B conference this year, it was interesting because while CEOs care most about growth, most of the attendees were focused on cost control, or cost savings, which is 6th on the CEO's list of concerns. By the way, the customer was 9th. That's my suggestion for you, Sarah. And what we're doing with our clients with long terms, we're looking at, for example, reducing complaints and identifying how much does it cost per complaint. And so we can show that we were averaging 1.2 complaints per client per year. Before I changed this, we tested something, and in that test group, it dropped down to 0.8 or whatever that is. Now you can bring in the savings of that. So we've saved 0.4 complaints per customer times the cost of complaint. And that's an area using that behavioral and operational data tied with a bit of financial, where you could start to show impact in the shorter term. And I know, Topher, you're a big fan of doing tests. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So when we think about establishing a cause, one of the best ways to do it, it's really brought to life in the pharmaceuticals industry. They do randomized control trials. It's their bread and butter. And I've seen a few of my pharmaceutical friends on the call today. That being said, we don't need sample size in the tens of thousands to be able to run a meaningful experiment. And so we can run business experiments very quickly. And when we're deploying actions, sometimes we fall into the trap of, all right, we got the budget, so we're going to go make the change, or we're just going to do a pilot. That's a missed opportunity, because a thoughtful deployment is a great way to establish some cause. So it's like, hey, let me actually roll it out to this group, but I have a test group that looks a lot like them. And so I can establish a difference between customer behavior in group A and customer behavior in group B. And I see far too few experiments happening in the world of CX. And I think it's a great opportunity to driving understanding of impact. Now, the added benefit is that sometimes you're asking for budget and you get turned down. Well, if you're only asking for a smaller budget, like, hey, give us a little bit of budget so we can experiment and we can validate it, can be a super helpful tool.
I'm a big believer in experiments. It's easier to do if you're a location-based organization. Like I mentioned, Link Logistics they go to specific markets. Retail, clearly good at that. It's a little bit more challenging if you're more centralized. We had a note from Doug here that there are a lot of things going on, so it can be hard to isolate it. And that's, if you're location-based, that's a little bit easier. But it's really critical to be able to isolate so you can show the impact.
And we'll talk about that a little bit more, because these business metrics that we're talking about influencing are not unique to CX. Like, every team in the company is trying to influence these metrics. And so how do we attribute changes or improvements to the work that we're doing? And we're going to talk about that. It's a very good question.
And I'm having fun with the questions we're asking. So I'm going to keep going for a minute here, Topher. I know you're going to roll with this. That's good. So Melanie asked, can you give examples of operational data versus behavioral data in B2B? And of course, it varies quite a bit. Let me use a few examples so if you can hop in as well. Manufacturing, for example, we have a lot of clients in manufacturing. On-time delivery is a key area in terms of operational data. So operational data is the data reflecting what you do. The behavioral data is showing what customers do. So behavioral data, that scenario would be, for example, how do customers order? Are they using your new online system? Are they sending an email to their sales rep? Some of our clients, are they sending spreadsheets over with what they want to order? Are they making a phone call? That's an example of behavioral data that matters, because the company wants them to use the digital channels. If you can show you're increasing the use of digital channels, changing their behavior, that's often a home run. If we flip over to SaaS software, for example, usage can be hard to collect, but is a great piece of behavioral data. For most SaaS companies, they're always trying to get their customers to use their software more. So if you can measure that. Outages, downtime, a bad outcome, but it's operational data. You can also show for operational data again, we're here looking at SaaS software, is how long it takes you to implement your new client. A time to value is a great one. So they signed the contract on this date. How many days until they were fully operational? Another behavioral would be number of issues raised. And that works at, we talked in the book about how Dow measured complaints. SaaS, number of service issues is a big deal. The operational data behind that would be how long it takes you to resolve it, or how long it takes you to respond for a request. So those are a couple examples of operational versus behavioral data. Andrea Kronberg recently led the customer experience at, or actually the placement experience at Kelly, the placement company. And she was the technical editor for Do B2B Better. And she really pushed me hard on that. Behavioral data is another form of voice of the customer. And then we also had anonymous person ask, any tips on showing ROI in the infancy of a program when you don't have the frequency of feedback to show a change in satisfaction tying to a change in revenue? And that's a case there where if you're starting out, coming back to the example where it takes 2 to 3 years before somebody renews, yeah, you can't wait for that. That's where the operational behavioral data are really key. So you can show how we change customers' behaviors for better for them and for us. It's not preventing customers from calling. It's creating better tools so they don't want to call. And looking at changes like that are really an area we can get impact right away.
And I'd add there, it's like, what actions are you driving? Sometimes at the very beginning of a program, it can be hard to get support for wide scale initiatives. Like, we want to change the way our company does resource allocation. Like that requires a lot of credibility. Driving process improvements can be a little bit easier or a little bit more attainable. And so can driving one-to-one issue resolution. So if your customers are giving feedback that they had a customer experience failure and you're driving, let's say, the front lines to go resolve those issues, you're driving meaningful change and meaningful action. And you can do that very early in the program.
Yeah.
You want to figure out, what's the difference in customer behavior among those that you're taking effective action with versus those that you aren't, or those that are receiving the improved processes versus those that aren't. Those can be realized. Some metrics, like Jim shared, like take longer to show up. Like customer lifetime value, you never actually know until the customer churns, because that's what kind of closes the book. But there's a lot of metrics along the way that can help you know what's going on.
All right, we got a lot of great questions. I'm only answering one more, then we'll come back to them in Q&A, which is Julie asked, so what I said, I'd focus on net revenue retention. Does that mean it's more important or valuable? No, I don't know that, but it isolates 2 outcomes of a great customer experience: retention and buying more. And what it is if you start the year with 1,000 customers and you end the year with 800 of those and you gain 200 new ones, you don't count the 200 new ones. You count the ones who stayed with you, in this case 800, and their average spending. So if they didn't change their spending, your net revenue retention is 80%, because we kept 80% of our customers spending at change. If you doubled their spending, good luck. Now it's 160% because you had 80% of people spending twice as much. It isolates 2 important outcomes to customer experience, and it's easier to calculate than customer lifetime value. Now, if your organization has a customer lifetime value calculation, I would go after that, but most don't. And so net revenue retention, you only need 2 pieces of data, and yet it's what the organization cares about.
And when we're figuring out metrics, we think about it like a Venn diagram. Circle A, things your company cares about. Circle B, things that you can influence. And you want to find where the overlap is. And so that often shows up in things like NRR, because you can influence customer churn, or you can influence how customers spend more or don't spend more, and your company cares about them.
And there's a third circle of Venn diagram too, which is what data can actually get. And usually you can get an extract of last year's sales, and that's customers, and that's usually data that's more gettable. I would generally recommend you start with an extract to find if there's something interesting in the data. And then when you show that interesting thing, the business is much more interested in making sure you get the data on an ongoing basis. All right, let's pick up some case studies, some examples of real organizations and what they've done. And we're going to talk about 4 common KPIs. Customer churn, and that's a common one a lot of people focus on. Order velocity, problem incidents, and digital support containment. Now, starting with customer churn, here is what you don't want to do. I mean, this is beginning analysis, which is to show that last year promoters churned at 90, or retained at 98%, and detractors retained at 90%. It's interesting. We care about it, but the business doesn't know what to do about it. And so I don't usually use Net Promoter Score or customer satisfaction, any of these, because these are outcomes that we believe correlate with the business outcomes. I like to go back to the driver questions because they will explain why the behavior was what it was. I'm going to use two case studies from a B2B to C organization. So I saw a note, Natasha, who's a B2B to C, it sounds like. This is not a pension company, but I think you'll probably see some correlation. In a B2B to C organization, one of the big questions is, who's the customer? And the answer is, of course, both the B2B, which is usually a distribution partner, like in this case, advisors. And then the C is the end owners of the product. And I know B2B companies who think that the advisor or the middle chair is the only customer, and others who really prioritize the end customer. They're both important. In this case, we were hired to do a maturity assessment and to change how the organization defines customer experience. What does it mean? How do we bring the voice of the customer into all of our decisions? And the most important thing this organization cares about was their advisors churning, spending more too. So we'll look at both these. So we look at churn, and so what I said is, well, do we have survey questions in 2021? Well, of course we do. Can we see who churned in 2022? Well, we can look at everybody who ordered in 2021 and didn't order in 2022. So great. That's all I need. Got a one-time extract. And their survey has 22 questions on it, outside of like the Net Promoter Score and some other things. You can see there's 1 on the brand, perception of the brand, 7 on the product, the satisfaction with commission, and then a number of experiential items, such as, for example, I have materials to support me, or the commission's process is easy, different experiential. Probably similar to yours. Some of you all have 5 questions, some of you have 50 questions, but they had 22. And so again, we looked at the 2021 scores compared to the behaviors in 2022, specifically churn. So I asked the executives, what do you think caused that churn? And it was all product and commissions. It was all about, is it rates and fees and things like that. That's a rational answer. Is it true? Because the organization behaved as if the product was the most important thing, a product-focused organization. You probably see that in your own organization. Well, here's what the truth was. Yes, commissions mattered. It was second. But everything else on the top 6 were experiential in nature. Broken processes, delays, issues with service that were causing the churn. Executives assumed it was based on the product. They would always go find a better product. But the data showed that it was about broken experiences instead. By the way, as a result of this analysis, my client got a full-time headcount specifically to do this kind of work, to show the impact of the behavioral operational data, actually the financial outcome and behavioral data combined with the survey data. Because like most organizations, they had the operational, behavioral, and financial data over here. They had the survey data over here, and never the twain shall meet. Now, they're also interested in order velocity, how often they order, and who's ordering more from us. So starting that same survey, we looked at what drives increased orders. We found was that actually first of all, satisfaction with commission didn't matter. And the 4 experiential items were 4 different items. And to understand this comes back to brain science. The part of the brain that is focused with frustration, anger, which leads to churn, is a different part of the brain that deals with happiness and delight, which leads to ordering more. And this case was more about feeling supported, having the resources they need to be effective. Now, problem incidents, another example. Roxy Strominger, my customer CX leader of the year for this year, actually 2023, but just recently got it. She's a VP of Customer Experience Strategy for UKG, which is a software company, does payroll benefits. They were looking at what causes people to call in. And they found that when the survey score of clear communication went up, cost to serve dropped, because embedded into her Qualtrics instance is the behavioral and financial data. And Roxy shows specifically that when customers say we communicate more clearly, they call us less often. And one last example is channel switching. And this comes from Ricardo Porta. In the book, Jen was the CX leader at the time. She's since been promoted to a global change management role. Ricardo is now their CX leader, has done some great work. And Dow focused on building a customer-centric digital process. We help them talk to their customers. We talk to customers all throughout the world to help them build a new customer channel. And when they did that, they found that their sales via Dow.com increased by 72% from 2020 to 2022. And they now have one of the largest B2B e-commerce platforms in the chemical manufacturing industry, over $4 billion of revenue that comes through that channel. And you can see they won 4 categories. They got silver in another, 2023 US awards, including overall and best digital transformation. So here are a few examples. I don't know, Topher, if we're going to come up with another case study. I don't know if you have any thoughts on these or other ways of showing.
Oh yeah. So I love the framing of experience value at risk. How much money is your organization leaving on the table due to bad or broken or inadequate experiences? And a lot of these metrics that Jim is sharing highlight it really well, like customer churn. You know, what are the drivers of your customer churn? And some of your customer churn might be structural, like the let's say your B2B, the customer you're serving went out of business, or B2C, like your customer moved, so they're no longer in your geography. But some of the reasons are addressable. You dropped the ball. You provided a negative experience. Your competitor improved something better than you improved it. There's a lot of reasons that we call squishy. And so for all of these metrics, we like to use that framing of, how much is squishy, or what's the experience value at risk? And that's a great way to put a dollar in front of your leaders to say, hey, we think we're leaving X number of $1 million on the table every year because of broken experiences. And over the next 2 to 3 years, we want to go tackle a piece of that pie. And here's the resources we need to go do it. Can be really helpful. Again, just framing.
And Rachel asked, was this the results I shared earlier about the drivers of churn? Was that from an NPS survey or a specific churn survey? That was their historical NPS survey that they'd run in 2021. It didn't require a new survey. We are doing a new survey of them to gather the emotional components of it, but it was simply going back and looking at past survey data and past behavioral data. Now, I go into a little bit more detail, actually a lot more, in Do B2B Better. Roxy is in there. She's one of 4 change makers of the case studies. Ricardo's predecessor, Jen, who again is still with Dow. She's in a global change management role, as well as Nancy Flowers from Haggerty. And Natasha, I can't share her name, but your Salesforce probably uses their software. But I can't, they did not give me the ability to share their name. But those are 4 case studies and the first section of the book is all about showing the financial impact of customer experience. But Topher has this cool ability that he uses to help isolate the impact of customer experience. Topher, can you walk us through this slide?
Yeah, and it's so simple, but I'm going to tell you some traps as to why it's so useful. So when you look at it, it's like, hey, the way that you create value is you either bring some new insight or capability to the organization. That results in a change or an action. That action improves certain KPIs, and then that translates into a business impact. So you hear that, it's like, okay, yeah, not groundbreaking. Jim, if you want to click through, I'll give an example. So, hey, we learned that there's a lot of support volumes from customers who had billing issues. Therefore, we worked with the respective team to refine and resolve those process issues. As a result of that, We saw a reduction in support volumes related to that issue. We also saw a reduction in customer churn. And then the last column is that's actually quantifiable. So the leap from column 3 to column 4 is really just algebra. But here's where it gets tricky. So when we talk to CX programs, they fall into, I think of it as 5 traps, or one of 5 traps. And if you're hearing these, think about which one you might be falling into. Bringing the insight or capability to the organization is generally not where we see people falling into traps. Once we get to action, though, we do. I mentioned one of them earlier. You're generating a bunch of insights, and then you're just throwing them over the fence. You don't know if or who is taking action on your insights. In CX, you have accountability to driving action, because if somebody asks you what value have you created, and you say, well, we generated a bunch of insights, the next question is, okay, so what? What did we change as a business? And so there's a level of responsibility, and it's okay that you function as a center of excellence, but finding a way to get visibility to who's taking action is important. Trap number 2, you've identified the action to take, and when you're going to request resources or budget, you just get rejected. So you fall into this trap where it's like we're trying to drive change, but we can't get the resources we need. The third trap here, still in the action column, is sometimes we
Actually, let me
think
pause
that,
for a minute, Topher.
yeah,
So the trap in number 2 was trying to do it on your own. If you're able to show the cause, the business can often get the resources much more often. So if you're trying to do this as a hero, you're in for some trouble. But if you can partner with the business and show them, because they are responsible for those KPIs you're trying to change, they typically have a much better opportunity of getting you the resources than you do on your own.
that's such a good observation. I really like the champion model, where if you're trying to build support and resources, like there's probably maybe a dozen stakeholders or more in your organization that you want to like change their behavior. Finding one that's friendly, saying, hey, let's work together. Let us help you drive this action. And creating success is a great way to then leapfrog to the next group and leapfrog to the next group until the organization kind of gets the vision and says, you know what, this is how we do things now. And so I love that comment you made, Jim. The third trap in action is thinking that launching a new survey is an action. And while that's great, so like, let's say we learned something in column 1, therefore we launched a new survey. You're still in column 1, because what did you learn from that new survey? And then what action is taken based on that to change the customer experience? Column 2, that's trap 3. Trap 4, we get into the third column, is not including business value metrics. And after hearing what we've been covering today, it's probably clear, like, hey, we need to talk about these customer behavioral metrics, because that's where the business value is going to show up. We can't just include like a CX metric there. That represents value to your customers, but you also need to know, how did that action drive change to customer behavior? And then the last one is that this can be a hard analysis problem. I saw a couple questions in the Q&A and a couple of comments like, how do we isolate the impact that we're having when so many other teams are trying to drive changes? And also there's external factors, market factors that are probably influencing customer churn or customer spend or cost to serve. But if that's the question you're asking the right question. Like, frame it as a causal inference. Like, how do we establish the cause? And there's a few ways to do that. We already talked about experiments. So if you're doing this proactively, you're trying to drive a change, like, hey, can we do a thoughtful experiment or a thoughtful rollout where we have a test in a control group or a treatment in a control group? You can also do that retroactively. Like, when we drove this initiative, is there a natural experiment? Did some frontline employees maybe adhere to best practices better than others? And how did their customers respond to them? And then the third is called an event study. And so if you're driving a really big change and it's really messy, like you can't drive an experiment or retroactive experiment, but your company has good prediction models, we can say, hey, let's look at where we predicted business results were going to be versus where they actually were. And that takes a little bit of controlling and cleaning to make sure you do it well. But that can be a useful tool when the other ones aren't available to you. And then I mentioned already, jump from column 3 to column 4 becomes really easy if we've done columns 1 through 3.
All right. Well, let's open up the Q&A then. Lisa, do we have any questions?
We sure do.
All
Let's
right.
see here. Let's start with this one. This one gives some background and then a question. So a regular challenge organizations face when investing in CX is dealing with the attitude behavior gap seen for most customers during the prototype/testing phase. So what have you seen work well to ensure that you take that into account in how you set up your customer testing approach and in your CX financial models?
Well, that's a great point. I remember Capital One 360. This has been about 10 years, so a bit of a dated story. But they shared that they measured two questions in their transactional survey. How simple was it to work with that website, whatever it is, or to resolve your problem, and how likely are you to recommend us? And they measured that against referrals. So in a logical world, of course, we don't live in that logical world, how likely are you to recommend would link directly to how many referrals they got. They found there was no linkage, but there was linkage between how simple the experience was and who actually referred them. And so the reason I'm bringing this up is that, first of all, exactly as you say, there isn't always a linkage between what people say they will do and what they actually do. In this case, they asked a survey, but then they actually brought in the behavioral data to show whether there's any linkage or not.
Yeah, I love that, Jim. The difference between stated and revealed preferences is what we're getting at. Like, did you do what you said you were going to do? Because they aren't one-to-one. There's a kind of embedded challenge there that we hear a lot in like product development. When CX teams are trying to influence product development, that's really messy to untangle too. Like, hey, we were in the room with 10 other people influencing the product direction. How much of that is attributable to us? And that can be really hard to untangle. Taking the mindset of, hey, when we win, everybody wins. So if your team is doing the work as like a shared service to be like, hey, look at the impact of this collective decision that we made. That can be a useful where you're raising everybody up. And also having a culture of back testing. So like knowing that there's a difference between stated preferences and revealed preferences. Well, ask after you launch, like, did it work? And so having that culture of saying, hey, what happened actually is really valuable.
Great, thank you. Moving on to another question here. How can you lock down from the customer that it was actually experience and not price or commission? The obvious answer is a survey, but many fail in experience result in customer walking away.
Well, the easiest answer from that is sample size. I realize that's easy for me to say. It may not be easy for you. In the case of what I shared earlier, we had enough, everybody had similar commissions. And so we're able to show what it was that separated from a sample size, I think it was about 500 customers. That's the first way. The second part is to be able to isolate variables. And so in that, again, not everybody is equally satisfied with the same commission. And so we did ask about satisfaction with commission, but we also asked about experimental features. Something else you can do is to look at some of the behavioral data. So for example, you can look at, do customers who primarily interact with you digitally have different outcomes than those who are interacting with you in an analog way? But it's all about isolating the different areas and sample size.
It's a reduction in uncertainty. Like sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking we need 100% precision. Like, hey, is that enough of a hypothesis to go and test it? And like, let's validate. Like we've generated the insight. We believe it's this. Can we get resources from the organization to go test and validate and see if behavior changes when we make the change?
Then a question for you, Topher, going back to your value chain exercise. This question says, when you say we under the action, it says we worked with the shipping team. Is that the CX team, or how do you get them to take action there?
Yes, very good question. We don't have time to answer the very broad question of like, how do we drive change? Like we've identified these opportunities where the company needs to make a change. How do we do that? And I mentioned the champion model can be really useful, like finding some groups that are friendlies, having success. There's a great example of a technology company that did this, and they ended up doing it about a dozen times where they leapfrogged from one champion to the next. And eventually the finance team brought them in and said, hey, we're hearing all this stuff about work you're doing, like what's going on. And coming out of that meeting, the finance team actually changed the process for requesting budget. So when a team wants to request budget, they have to do the business value impact. And now they have to do what's the impact on the customer experience? How are we impacting value we're creating for the customer? So they standardized it. And that's a journey. And so that can be a really good way to do it. I also think that if you're doing this at scale, like you're providing insights throughout the organization to many groups, having a simple survey that maybe monthly or quarterly goes to teams that you shared insights with and said, hey, we shared this insight with you. What did you do in result? And so even just getting, we call it like the insight to action rate, like how many insights did we generate over a certain time period and how many were acted on? That can be a really useful measure to help you know how you're doing in terms of driving action, but also where's action happening and what are the reasons why action isn't happening? Maybe you're not framing it in a way that people see that it's a win for them, or maybe you're communicating it to the wrong people. And so, but also like very hard challenge. So I respect like the challenge, like, and there's a lot of information, maybe as a follow-up, Jim and Melissa, we can send a link or two. There's article from the XM Institute that I think might be good there. But anyway, Jim, I'd love to have you chime in on that one. That's such a good challenge.
Actually, we're up on time, so I would like to, but we're up on time. I want to make sure we get to your final case study. And so I'm actually going to pass on that so we can get to your case study, because I want to make sure you share
Okay.
bringing that earlier to life.
All right. Yeah. So bringing the value chain to life. So here's it's a technology company. In 2020, they found that responsiveness was the biggest source of pain for their customers. And they did a little bit of additional digging, like interviews, further studies, so they could refine what the organization needs to do. Moving into column 2, they deployed a number of significant initiatives, including let's define what responsiveness looks like. Let's provide training on it. Let's set targets and provide visibility. And then let's implement a closed loop process where we can actually measure, hold people accountable. As a result of that, they found that the employees that adhered to responsiveness best practices, remember I talked about natural experiment, looking backwards, is there a test and a control group? So looking at those who adopted versus those who didn't adopt, they found a meaningful difference in customer churn rate, as well as in opportunity rate. And again, the leap from column 3 to 4 is really just algebra. And so we can take that 4% reduction in client churn and that 10% improvement in client win rate as $11 million since the inception of the project. So about 2.5 years, they've created $11 million net of all the costs to achieve those benefits. So net of the variable costs and net of the cost to deploy the initiative. That team is very proud of. I'm proud of them too. That it was significant. Yeah. Anyway, there's the story.
All right. I can't leave without answering the question about NPS. It's got there. Somebody asked, what's your opinion on NPS? We hear more skepticism around the metric at org the past few years. If you look at my blog post writings, you can find that I'm a great lover of NPS and I'm a great hater of NPS. You might wonder, how can both be true? When I look at and I'll bring up our resources here. When I look at a metric, what I care about is, does it predict something I'm interested in? Is it a reliable predictor? In that B2B to C organization we talked about earlier, NPS was a great predictor of what advisors did. So coming back to, let's see, who asked about the pension administrator? So Natasha, probably similar to you. For them, they found that NPS was a good predictor of the distribution arms behaviors. They found it did not predict consumer behavior whatsoever for them. So the right answer to NPS is, does it tell you something important about your customers' behaviors? If it does, I'm a huge fan of NPS. I will sign up for it every minute. If it doesn't, then get rid of it and find something else that does. So thank you all for coming on this journey. Oh, go ahead, Topher.
I was going to say, agreed. Is it helping you drive action and drive change?
So thank you all for coming on this journey with us. As you can guess, we could be here another hour. Topher and I kept talking about this afterwards there. We will be, of course, sending out a survey to you afterwards. Get your feelings about this. This is a different format for us. And so love to get your thoughts. And so we do have a link to the blog that Topher and I co-wrote. It's up on the XM Institute. It'll be on Heart of the Customer soon. As well as if you'd like to meet with me, and learn more about how we do this work, how you can do this work, we've got the QR code for that. I'll pass it back to Lisa.
Yeah, that's the end of the webinar today. Like I said, we will be uploading the recording, so that will be publicly available. And we can include these links that we discussed in our follow-up email as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. And with that, we will wrap up. So enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your week, and your holidays.
All right. Thanks all.